Hi. I want to just riff on boundaries for a moment. So I'm going to start by quoting Dr. Becky. I don't know how else to refer to her because I think that's how she goes on social media and on her whole brand. But Dr. Becky, you can find her on Instagram. She teaches about child development, parenting, and things like that. She's wonderful. Really great. Highly recommend, especially if you're a parent or if you're parenting your inner child. But I absolutely love the way that she says this because it's so perfect and it's so concise, which is, boundaries are when I tell other people what I'm going to do. Boundaries are when I tell other people what I'm going to do, right? And I could sit here and riff about how boundaries are not about controlling other people and they're about ourselves, and I will. But I think that says it really concisely. It's beautiful. And in a simple, concise sentence like that, we don't get into a lot of the nuance of what that means to us and how we actually experience that. So one thing I do want to say is that boundaries don't actually even require telling or informing another person of anything. We can also set boundaries with ourselves. We can also just decide this is my boundary and not necessarily communicate it to the other person. It really depends on our relationship with the other person, on the specific circumstances, on the specific boundary. And one thing that is really important, and that I notice gets brought up a lot, especially in those of us that are just learning how to enforce boundaries or even figure out what the fuck our boundaries are. What do we even want? What do we even need? What do we even want or need from other people or from the relationships in our lives? So one is, how do I know? How do I know what my boundaries are? How do I know what, boundaries can be telling someone else what I'm going to do. How do I know what I'm going to do? How do I know what I need to do? That is a long process. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be long. It could be a pretty quick process with yourself in the moment to find a specific boundary. And this is about the process of coming back into a relationship with ourselves, with all the parts of ourselves, with all of our various needs and desires and our authenticity. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. But in just an immediate circumstance, I would want you to ask yourself, right? Okay, how do I feel in this situation? If I notice if it's around another person, if I notice myself thinking, how do they feel? How are they going to react? Right. Reeling that in, putting it over here, and then reflecting on, how do I feel? Right. And if that's a really big struggle for you, then even thinking, if I saw someone else in this situation, my child, my loved one, another person in the situation like this, what would I want for them? Right. And then another piece of this, I could go into that a lot more, but I'm going to leave it at that for the sake of this video not being an hour long. Another piece of this is, if we're communicating what we're going to do to another person, how do we deal with their response? And here's the deal, is you actually don't deal with their response, because their response is not your responsibility. You deal with your response, your internal response. So if they respond poorly, if they get triggered, they get upset, they blame you, they get mad at you, they misunderstand you, it's not your job to deal with that. That is so hard, and that is not your job to deal with that. It's your job to deal with what comes up in you. Feelings of guilt, feelings of confusion, second guessing, being sadness or grief or whatever that comes up with an insecurity that comes up with feeling misunderstood by someone, wanting to explain ourselves, wanting to explain our choices, wanting to make them understand, wanting them to see us as a good person, right? All of that stuff, that's your responsibility. And depending on the circumstance and the relationship, if this is a relationship with someone that's emotionally safe, probably won't respond poorly to your boundaries. But let's just say it's a person that's emotionally safe and maybe they're triggered and it's not quite right. Then that would be a circumstance in which you can, come down to a place of vulnerability and talk about what you're afraid of and what you're wanting and what you need, and come to a resolution. Now, if you think it's a safe relationship and you go to do that and that doesn't work out, it's probably not a safe relationship. If this is someone who's not emotionally safe, someone who's been abusive towards you, what have you, none of that is what you should be doing, right? And don't get me wrong. I mean, we all go through our own processes with this, and maybe that's what you do this time, and maybe you're still learning that lesson for yourself or what that looks like for you in this situation. But ultimately, that is not going to work out. They're certainly not going to understand you. how do we deal with our own internal response? That's the next question that I had written down. So how do we deal with our own internal response? Well, there's a lot of ways that we can feel our feelings and process our feelings. I'm going to recommend to you my favorite way of doing that, which is from a parts work and a child work lens. So feeling comes up, let's say the feeling is guilt. I'm going to acknowledge the guilt. I'm going to connect with that feeling of the guilt in my body. I'm going to let myself feel that. Ooh, it's sticky and it's uncomfortable. It's painful to feel that. Maybe I might even ask myself, when was the first time I felt this feeling of guilt? When was the last time? When was the last time? When was the last time? When was the first time? Seeing how far back I can go and where I can trace this, just for the sake of self-awareness and potentially deeper processing. But what I'm for sure going to do is I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to validate it even. Now, people get really weird about the word validation. When I say validate, I do not mean tell it that it's right. I do not mean say, yes, I should be guilty. I should feel guilty. No. I mean, validate the fact that you have this feeling and that you're feeling this for a reason. We spend so much time saying like, oh, why do I feel this way? Like, seriously, I promise you, if you just take a moment to reflect internally and actually feel into yourself, you know why. Why do I feel guilty? Maybe because I am afraid of being a bad person. Why do I feel guilty? Maybe because I am confused about the situation. Why do I feel guilty? Maybe because when I was a kid, someone said this to me or reacted to me this way, or this is how people handle their emotions, or I saw someone constantly self-sacrificing and I don't even know what it means to be a good person or who I am, right? Like, there's so much there. Maybe I feel angry at their response. Okay, I feel angry. Let's acknowledge that. I feel angry. Let's validate that. Of course I feel angry. How unacceptable it is. How shitty it is that this person's responding to me this way, right? And there's all different feelings that you can have, but just going through acknowledging, validating the feeling, not the reality. Not that it's the reality, but that it's valid. And then allowing it. Allowing yourself to feel it. And this part's kind of sticky too. When I say allowing, this video's already 7 minutes long. When I say allowing, some people will say like, I do allow my feelings, right? One of my favorite analogies for this is like someone goes on vacation, which I heard this from a teacher forever ago. When someone goes on a vacation and they're like lean back in their chair and they're like this and they're like, oh, I'm on a vacation. But the whole time they're just thinking about work and they're like never actually fully relaxing. And they go back to work and someone's like, man, you really need a vacation. They're like, I just took a vacation. But did they? No, not really. So we spend a lot of our lives feeling our feelings in resistance. And then we never actually process and move through them. And I know that's so frustrating and it can feel so counterintuitive to the idea of leaning in, allowing an uncomfortable, painful feeling to get bigger and allowing it more and more and like releasing that resistance to it. And if there is a lot of resistance there, then do the same thing with the resistance first. Acknowledge the resistance, validate the resistance, be present with the resistance. Why am I feeling resistant? What's going on here? When was the first time I felt this way? How did other people react when I felt these types of feelings and I, enacted them outwardly when I was a child? How did I see other people handle their feelings, right? Like, delve into that, deal with that resistant part, and then you say, and I need to go over here to this vulnerable aspect of myself. I need to go into these vulnerable feelings and feel them because I know there's so much juice there. I know how important it is. And I also know that I can't get through to the other side of actually having processed them unless I feel them first and release that resistance. Okay, so I already said that you don't need to inform other people of your boundaries and that your boundaries aren't always going to be about other people. A lot of the boundaries that you set are going to be with your relationship with yourself. Realistically, all of them are, whether they involve another person or not. So I want to add this in, and I honestly think this might be the most important part of all, and I'm going to try and say this as concisely and quickly as possible so this video isn't absurdly long. But I like to reframe this as boundaries are my desires, my needs, and my standards. Okay? So what are my desires? Now, desires can be weird and fluid and iffy, and that's okay. But we can feel into, the more we work with ourselves, the more we get to know ourselves, we feel authentic desires. What do I want? And then what about what I want do I really need? What do I need? And I want, for most of you, especially if you're healing from codependency and people pleasing and self-sacrificing, which a lot of people who come to me, most of the people who come to me are, like, I want you to put what you want and need in the same fucking category. This is like really, really important actually. Even if it feels selfish, even if it feels whatever, it's really, really important. So for right now, I'm putting what you want and what you need in the same category, and then saying what I need is my standard. And now this is this is setting the standard. That's when it gets really hard. That's when you then have to deal with all the feelings that come up in you and all the feelings that come up with anyone else who enters into your life, who hits that standard and either meets up to it or doesn't. Then you get to decide, what's the standard, right? If someone doesn't meet the standard, what do I do? Do I want to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't meet the standard? What do I want my life to look like? And what if I'm not meeting the standard? What am I going to do about that? And I can talk about this more in another video.